Are you ready to go to war? Well, first, you need to learn how to play the game. Let's take a look. Learn how to play chess.
Chess is one of the oldest and most recognized games in the world. It is an exciting game of strategy and planning, which is why it is seen as a symbol of intelligence. However, chess is easy to learn and can be enjoyed by anyone at any level. Chess is played on an 8x8 board with 64 squares and 32 pieces, and the game is all about checkmating the king. Once the king is in checkmate, which we'll explain later, then the game is over. So to start, let's meet the king. Even though the king is the most important piece in chess, it isn't the most powerful. The king can only move one square at a time in any direction. Here are the squares where the white king can currently move. Here's one move. Now the king could move here, and here's another king move. In chess, both players have identical sets of pieces. You have a king, and so does your opponent. Each player will take turns making a move until the game is over. Now that you've learned how the king moves, it's your turn to practice moving the king. The king might be the most important piece in chess, but the queen is by far the most powerful. Like the king, the queen can move in any direction, forward, backward, to the sides, as well as diagonally. Unlike the king, the queen can move as far as she wants in any direction. The one thing the queen can't do is jump over other pieces. Let's look at some queen moves. In this position, the queen could go all the way up the diagonal. She could slide all the way across the board. She could now move all the way down here, or she could make some shorter moves, like here, here, and here's another queen move. Earlier, we mentioned that the queen cannot jump over other pieces. In this position, let's say the queen wants to get to this square. Notice that the king is currently in the way of the queen, so the queen would have to move to another square first, and only then, on the next turn, could the queen move here. Now that you've learned how the queen moves, it's your turn to practice moving the queen. After the queen, the rook is the second most powerful piece. It can move up, down, and to the sides as far as it wants, but the rook can only move in straight lines. Like the other pieces we've looked at so far, the rook also can't jump over any other piece. Let's take a look at some rook moves. In this position, the rook could move straight up, it could slide to the corner, it could move all the way down the board, now it could swing to the other side, or it could make some shorter moves, like here and here. Now that you've learned how the rook moves, it's your turn to practice moving the rook. The bishop is one of the most interesting pieces in chess because it can move as far as it wants, but only on diagonals. The bishop, just like the other pieces that we've met so far, cannot jump over other pieces. This means that the bishop has to stay on the same colored square it starts the game on for the entire game. In chess, you get two bishops. This bishop is called the light squared bishop because it can only travel on the light squares. Meet the other bishop that you have in the game, the dark squared bishop. It moves exactly like the light squared bishop, but only on the dark squared diagonals. Now that you've met both bishops, let's take a look at how they move. With just one move, the dark squared bishop can enter the longest dark squared diagonal on the board. Let's do the same with the light squared bishop. Now, notice no matter how many bishop moves we make, the bishops never cross paths. They never block each other. And the reason why is because they're on opposite colored squares, so they never interfere with each other. They make a good team. Now that you've learned how the bishops move, it's your turn to practice moving the bishops. The knight is perhaps the most fun piece in chess. It is the only piece in chess that does not move in some sort of straight line. It moves in a strange L shape. The other interesting thing about the knight is it's the only piece in chess that can jump over other pieces, like this. It takes a little practice to understand exactly how the knight moves. It goes two squares in one direction and then one square to the side, like this. Highlighted are all the possible squares the knight can move to on the next turn. Notice it always moves in the same pattern. Two to the side and over one, like this, or like this, up two and over one, or down two and over one. And notice that the knight moves from a light square to a dark square, and then on the next turn it moves from a dark square to a light square. The knight always switches colors with each turn it makes. Now that you've learned how the knight moves, it's your turn to practice moving this fun and tricky piece. The pawn sounds like it is the humblest of chess pieces, but it is really one of the most powerful. When working together, pawns are the soul of chess. Pawns have a few strange rules, so make sure to pay attention. Pawns can only move straight forward, and they can only move one square at a time. However, if it is their first move of the game, they can choose to move 2 squares forward if there is nobody blocking them, as pawns cannot jump over other pieces. Remember, the pawn can choose to advance 1 or 2 squares only on the first move. On all other moves, the pawn advances 1 square. Pawns are also the only piece in chess that cannot move backwards. One other thing that makes them strange is that while they cannot move straight forward, pawns can only capture diagonally, and they can only capture 1 square away diagonally even if it is their first turn. We will explain capturing in one of the next lessons. Let's see some pawn moves. In this position, since this pawn has yet to move in the game, white decides to move it 2 squares forward. Black, on the other hand, only advances this pawn 1 square. Remember, even though you can move your pawn 2 squares on its first move, you're not forced to do so. White now advances the pawn forward, and now both pawns are blocked and cannot move. In this position, how many white pawns can move? If you said 1, you're correct. Notice that this pawn is blocked by the black pawn directly in front of it. Remember, pawns cannot move backwards. White now has the option to move this pawn up 1 square. Notice this pawn cannot move 2 squares forward because the black pawn blocks it. Now it's your turn to practice using the pawns. Remember, your pawns are the only pieces that cannot move backwards, so what happens when they reach the other side of the board? They get a promotion. You must trade your pawn for another piece. It can be a knight, a bishop, a rook, or the powerful queen. It cannot stay a pawn, and it cannot become a king. Also, it does not have to be one of the pieces already captured in the game. Every pawn has the potential to be promoted into a queen. You could trade it for another queen and have 2 queens on the board, which is incredibly powerful. Now, let's practice promoting some pawns. Called castling. This move was invented to speed up the game and do 2 things at once. When you castle, your king moves toward the safety of the corner and your rook comes toward the action in the middle. You literally are moving 2 pieces at once, but it counts as just 1 move. You can castle in either direction, left or right. In either case, your king moves over only 2 squares, and then the rook from that side is moved directly to the other side of the king, like this. And here's another example of castling. Castling is a great move with many benefits if it is used at the right time. However, there are a few conditions that may prevent you from castling. First off, you cannot castle when you are in check. You must first deal with the check before trying to castle. Secondly, you cannot castle if your king would castle through a check, or after castling, your king would land into a check. Next, you cannot castle if there are any pieces in between your king and your rook. It must be completely empty. In this position, both white and black have to move 1 piece before they're able to castle. After knight f3 and bishop c5, for example, both sides are now able to castle kingside. Finally, you cannot castle if your king has made any other move before, or if the rook you are castling with has already moved. It must be the first move for both pieces. In this position, the only legal castling move is for black. Since white's king has already moved, white cannot castle. Notice black can only castle with the rook on h8 because the other rook has already moved. What is the notation for castling? It depends on if you castle kingside or queenside. In this position, let's say white castles kingside. The way you would write it is 0-0. If black now castles queenside, we would add 1 more 0, so it would be 0-0-0. One way that can help you remember this is notice on the king side there are 2 squares between the white king and the rook. Notice 0-0 has 2 zeros. So kingside castling, 2 squares, 2 zeros. Notice on the queen side, there's 3 squares between the king and the rook. Queenside castling has 3 zeros, 0-0-0. Now it's your turn to castle. Check is the word that is used when one piece is threatening to capture the other side's king. Check basically means look out, king in danger. Let's take a look at some examples of playing check. In this position, can you see how white can threaten to capture the black king? That's right, bishop to f6 check. White's bishop puts the black king in danger of capture, so black must deal with this check. In the next lesson, we'll learn about the 3 ways of getting out of check. In this position, black's rook can put white's king into danger. After rook d1, the white king is in check, and white must respond to this attack. Finally, in this position, black's pawn is ready to capture the white knight. Remember, pawns capture 1 square away diagonally. Can you see how white can escape the pawn's attack and place the black king into check? If you found knight to g6, great job. The knight escapes danger and now puts the black king into check. One final question is, how do we notate a check? It is pretty easy. All you do is add a plus to the end of your typical move notation. This means after writing ng6, you add a plus at the end. So it'll look like this, ng6 plus, meaning that black is in check. Now it's your turn to practice playing check. If a king is in check, and it cannot escape check by moving, blocking, or capturing, then the king is said to be in checkmate. That means you win. Or maybe your opponent won. Again, checkmate is the entire goal of chess. It doesn't matter who has captured the most pieces, or how long it has taken, or anything else. If the king is in checkmate, it's game over. Once the king is in checkmate, you don't have to take the king off the board. It's time to shake hands and say, good game. Now it's your turn to checkmate. Let's talk more about capturing. In chess, when you capture a piece, you simply move your own piece to the same square as your opponent's piece and replace their piece with your own. The captured piece is then removed from the board. You don't stop before the captured piece, you replace it entirely. Let's watch this queen capture a pawn. Now let's watch this knight jump over one of its own pieces to capture the queen. Capturing pieces is a critical part of the game. However, you do not have to capture a piece if you don't want to. That being said, if you can capture more of your opponent's pieces than they capture of yours, it's going to be much easier to win. One question about capturing that we haven't answered is, how do you notate a capture? Let's say in this position that you plan on taking the black queen with your queen on b3. A good idea. You would write the piece that will capture it, in this case, the queen. So we use a capital Q. You then write an X, which means captures. And then you write the square where the piece gets captured. So after queen takes e6, we would write Q, X, e6. Here is one more capturing question. How do we notate a pawn capturing a rook and promoting to a queen at the same time? Does it sound complicated? Don't worry, it's just one extra step. We start by notating the capture. Remember, we mark a pawn with the file that it is currently on. In this case, the pawn is on the B file. So we would write a lowercase b, then we would write captures, which is an X, so lowercase b, X, and then the square that we capture, A8. So BX A8. So far, we have BX A8. Since we are promoting to a queen, you simply add to the end of your move an equal sign, and then write which piece you are promoting the pawn into, which is usually the queen. So putting it all together, we would write B takes A8 equals queen. Now it's your turn to practice capturing pieces.
Now that you've learned some skills, let's put them to the test. Take down your opponent. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps with the algorithm and brings new chess players to the platform.